My guest today, Dr. Walter Semkiw, is a board-certified occupational medicine physician who has retired now from a major medical center in San Francisco, where he served as the Assistant Chief of Occupational Medicine. Previously, he served as medical director for Unicall 76, a Fortune 500 company. Walter embarked on reincarnation research in 1995, and he is the author of Return of the Revolutionaries, The Case for Reincarnation and Soul Groups Reunited. He also penned Born Again and Origin of the Soul and the Purpose of Reincarnation. Walter is an advocate of pioneer reincarnation researcher, Dr. Ian Stevenson, and Walter's spoken at conferences all over the world. Walter says, and I quote, "We fight over cultural markers of identity, though in truth, we are all the same. We are all of one family." He says, "All I want to do is stop the creation of enemies through evidence of reincarnation." And I think we would all definitely be looking at each other in a new light if we understood that we're really all one family. Welcome back to the 24th hour, Walter. Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Yay. Well, and my family has been a huge fan of your research and the contribution that you're making in bringing people together. I'm wondering if you could tell people a little bit about how you got into it and about Dr. Ian Stevenson.
Yeah, so the way I got into reincarnation research was really on a lark. I was doing my occupational medicine residency in Chicago, and a friend of mine told me I should go see this medium who was working out of a local metaphysical bookstore. And she told me that this medium channels your spirit guides, and that this guy's really good and it's worth the money. Well, at the time, I didn't believe in psychics or mediums, but it was winter in Chicago and there wasn't much else to do. So I kind of went for entertainment. And to make a long story short, in the session, they told me that I was John Adams, the second U.S. president.
That's right.
Which, I didn't believe. I had heard that psychics tell people that there's somebody famous in a past lifetime because that's what people want to hear. And, I was in medicine and had really no interest in politics, so it made no sense to me, and I pretty much dismissed it. 12 years went by, and I was in Hawaii, which was part of my territory with Unicall 76. And I was meeting with managers in the morning, and then they said, let's have a luncheon meeting, and let's meet at the parking lot in 10 minutes, and we'll go to a restaurant. So I was the first one in the parking lot, just waiting for everybody else. It was broad daylight. I was standing up, wide awake, where out of nowhere, this booming voice inside my head said, "Study the lifetime of Adams." And it was so powerful.
Wow.
It was as if there was a megaphone inside my skull. And nothing like that had ever happened before, and it's never happened since. But, I couldn't deny it happened, and it got my attention. And that night I went to the bookstore in Honolulu, got books on Adams and the American Revolution, and realized that in some portraits I look exactly like him. As I read about him, I saw that our personality traits were exactly the same, both good and bad. And over time, I started to recognize people in his lifetime that seemed to be reincarnated around me. For instance, my brother George is a dead ringer for Adams's brother Peter, and my other brother Leo, who's an orthopedic surgeon, looks exactly like one of Adams's best friends, whose name was Cotton Tufts, who was also a physician.
Wow.
And over time, I made about 60 proposed matches. But I didn't, really know for sure if this was true. And I'm not independently wealthy. I have to work, or at least I had to work before I retired. And I was concerned about going public and running around saying I'm John Adams if I'm not, and having people think I'm crazy and maybe lose my job. So,
Right.
what I did at one point was I tried to find psychics or mediums in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live who could help me, sort this out. And I went through about a dozen of them, and none of them seemed to be able to do that. Then I met Kevin Ryerson,
Yes.
who is the trance medium who's worked with Shirley MacLaine for 40 years, and he played himself in the movie Out on a Limb.
That's right.
And so I started to work with Kevin, and as a trance medium, Kevin goes into a meditative state and basically goes to sleep and allows spirit beings to take over his body so
Yes.
that they can speak to human beings. And when these spirit beings take over his body, the voice changes, the mannerisms change. I mean, it's like there's a completely different person sitting in front of you. And I found that Kevin channels a spirit guide named Atun Ray, who last lived in ancient Egypt about 3,500 years ago, who showed to me that he can make accurate past life matches.
Yes.
Can I tell you one example of what sort of convinced me?
Absolutely.
So probably one of the most dramatic cases involves Ralph Nader.
Okay.
Well, my first book, Return of the Revolutionaries, is primarily my story. And in it, I identify a cohort from the American Revolution who has reincarnated in contemporary times. And for instance, the people in the 2000 election cycle, which included George W. Bush and Bill Clinton and Al Gore, I had figured out by various means who I thought they were in the American Revolution. And later, Atun Ray affirmed those matches. But I had no idea who Ralph Nader could have been, because Nader was in that same group of people running for president. So I asked Atun Ray, and again, I had no hypothesis of who he was. I asked, was Nader incarnate in the American Revolution? And Atun Ray told me that he was a major player in the Continental Congress, that if I found his portrait, I would see he has the same facial features. And I asked, well, what was his name? And Atun Ray told me Thompson. Well, that's very specific information. Continental Congress, Thompson, this should be easy to find. And by now I had a whole library on the American Revolution myself. And I looked through all my books and I could not find a Thompson anywhere. And I almost gave up on it, but I went to the San Francisco Public Library and went through every book they had on the American Revolution. And what I would do is just go to the indices of these books, just looking for a Thompson. And finally, in this old book published in 1935, it said, Thompson, Charles Thompson, portrait of Charles Thompson. And I go to that page, and he's a dead ringer for Ralph Nader. And then now that I have the full name, Charles Thompson, I was able to learn more about him, and he has the same personality traits and passions as does Nader. Wow. And in the Revolutionaries book, I actually take passages that Thompson wrote and passages that Nader wrote, and they're basically saying the exact same thing. They were advocates for the underdog, for Native Americans, and so forth. The funny thing is, since it turned out that the reason I couldn't find him in my books is he was not himself an elected representative to the Continental Congress. Rather, he was the secretary of the Congress for the full 13 years of its existence.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And you might wonder, well, if he was a secretary for so long, why wasn't he at least for one term, elected a representative himself.
Right.
And the history book said it was because he was too radical to be elected.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, and then I've been working with Kevin since 2001, pretty much on a monthly basis. And he demonstrated this ability over and over again, where I would ask who was somebody in a past lifetime. He would tell me. I many times never even heard of this individual, but
Right.
told me where I should look, and I would find them. And everything matched, same face, same personality, same talents. So over time, I realized I gained trust that Atunre has this ability. But so that's one part of what I do is my work with Kevin Ryerson and making past life matches for historical and celebrity figures. But really, one of the more important thing for me is disseminating objective evidence of reincarnation derived through independently researched cases.
Yes.
And this is where Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia comes in.
Fantastic. Yes. I mean, it's amazing what your website, and I have it here. People can go to reincarnationresearch.com. And it's amazing that the crossover, sometimes people incarnate as Christians, sometimes they incarnate as Hindus, as Muslims, whatever it is. We switch genders, we switch everything. I really put a lot of interest in pulling back the lens, and your work is bringing people together in the sense that if we can just look from a broader perspective, we really are all one family. We've kind of
Right.
been all of it and taken on all these different roles. Right?
Yeah, and that's really why I'm so passionate about this work and
Yeah.
why I created the website and all that. Because as you mentioned, people can change religion, ethnicity, nationality from one lifetime to another. And most wars and conflicts are based in differences in these cultural markers of identity.
Right.
Probably one of the most dramatic cases involves the reincarnation of Anne Frank.
Yes.
Most people know that Anne Frank died in the Holocaust in a concentration camp. She died in 1945. Well, 9 years later, Barbara Carlin was born into a Christian family in Sweden.
Right.
And uh, as soon as she could speak, she told her parents, "My name's not Barbara, it's Anna Frank, and you're not my real parents. My real parents are going to come and get me and take me to my real home." And she had full memories of the life of Anne Frank. She remembered the attic where the family hid in Amsterdam for 2 years, hiding from the Nazis. She remembered the concentration camp, all the details. And she related this to her parents, and her parents, who were Christian, had no idea what she was talking about.
Right. Right.
In part because they did not know who the historic Anne Frank was. And that's because the diary of Anne Frank had not yet been translated, published, and distributed in Sweden. So when she told her parents this, when she was 2, 3 years old, they had no idea who Anne Frank was. And in fact, they were so concerned, they had her evaluated by a psychiatrist, because they were concerned she was mentally ill.
That's right.
The psychiatrist said, well, by this time, she learned not to talk about her past life memories because, as she says, everybody got so tense. So when she saw the psychiatrist, she just said nothing about her past life memories, and he said she's fine, and life went on. Things changed when she was 10 years old, and the family went on a vacation touring major cities of Europe. And one of the places they went to was Amsterdam. And by that time, the parents knew who the historic Anne Frank was. And so her father wanted to go to the Anne Frank Museum, and he picked up the phone at the hotel to get a cab to take him there. And Barbara says, well, we don't need a cab. It's right near here. And they said, how could you know? You've never been here. Well, she said, I'll show you. And she took them by the hand and led them on a 10-minute walk through the winding streets of Amsterdam straight to the Anne Frank house. Then inside the room where Anne had slept, she looked at a wall and said, look, Mommy, the pictures of the movie stars are still on the wall. And her mother looked at the wall and then looked at Barbara and said, Barbara, the wall is bare. There's nothing there. And Barbara looked again and realized that was true, got confused, upset. And her mother said, well, let's ask the tour guide. And the tour guide said, well, yes, normally the pictures of movie stars that Anne Frank had clipped out of magazines and pasted on the wall used to be there, but people were touching them, taking them, damaging them. So we removed them, but we're going to put them back up, but under glass, so they're protected. And it was at this point that her parents realized that these weren't fantasies, they were past life memories. And Barbara, just like Anne Frank, was a childhood writing prodigy. She had her first book of prose published at age 12, which became the best-selling prose book in Swedish history. And she even has the same facial features as Anne Frank.
Yes, and anybody can see this again on Walter's website, reincarnationresearch.com. It's pretty incredible when there's a physical resemblance, isn't there?
And all these memories. And the moral of the story is, if the Nazis knew that one could be Jewish in one lifetime and Christian in another, the Holocaust could never have happened. And similarly, all the fighting now in the Middle East will cease when Muslim people realize they can reincarnate as Hindus or Christians and vice versa.
Right. It's really incredible. Again, I always go to the kind of pulling back the lens and looking at everything from a bigger picture so that people can experience a little more peace. You know, the story of Anne Frank also brings me to your website. There are a lot of children that you talk about that have these very clear memories, and you cite a lot of cases.
Yeah, let me turn now to the work of Ian Stevenson.
Yes.
And by the way the website is set up, and again, it's reincarnationresearch.com, and reincarnation research is one word. And on the left-hand side of the homepage, you'll see a whole series of case categories, such as physical resemblances from one lifetime to another, change of religion and nationality from one lifetime to another, birthmarks related to past life wounds. There's 10 specific categories, and all the independently researched cases that demonstrate those principles of reincarnation are then pulled up for viewers to review on their own. And the real power of the cases is the amount of detail that these little children come up with about their past lives. I mean,
incredible.
They come up with so much detail that you really need to read the case fully to really appreciate them. And that's why I built the website that way. I mean, if I tried to talk about there's about 250 cases on the website.
That's right.
And, you know, if I wanted to talk about all of them, we'd be here till, next week.
That's right.
But just to go back to Ian Stevenson, he was an academic psychiatrist at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He was the chairman of the department, mainstream psychiatry. And then he heard about these children who have spontaneous memories of past lives. And most of these cases came from India or Asia. And so he decided to publish some of these cases and travel to India to research these, and he
Mhm.
found a plethora of these cases. He thought he would go and investigate one or two, but he found through word of mouth many cases. And in the typical Ian Stevenson case, which Barbara Carlin's case, the Anne Frank case, presented as a typical Stevenson case. In these cases, as soon as the child can speak, they tell their parents, my name's not what you're calling me. My real name is so-and-so, and you're not my parents, and this is not my real home. And my real parents are going to come and take me to my real home. And eventually the child gives enough information, including the names of the past life family members, the village or town that they lived in. They give enough specific information that the biologic family can locate and meet the past life family. And when the child is brought into contact with the past life family, the child can identify people by name and relationship, know things that nobody outside the family would know.
Just amazing.
And the past life family accepts the child as the reincarnation of their deceased loved one. And Ian Stevenson studied about 2,500 of these types of cases. And in over 1,500, the child's past life memories were verified, through the past life family.
Gosh, it's just incredible. It's just incredible.
Evidence of reincarnation research is going to totally change the world.
Absolutely.
It's going to take a little time, but it will. And by the way, one parallel, I mentioned before, I was identified as the reincarnation of John Adams. I kind of like to point out that in this lifetime, I'm doing the same thing as he did. He became a lawyer and a politician,
right?
And got involved in the American Revolution to take power away from political monarchies and give power to the people. Well, what evidence of reincarnation is going to do is take power away from the religious monarchies, the old religions. They're like monarchies. And this evidence of reincarnation is going to level the playing field. And people will realize, they're not Jewish or Christian or Muslim, they're human beings. and really there's going to be a change of identity from these cultural factors like religion, nationality, ethnic affiliation, to just people understanding they're human beings who reincarnate to learn and grow.
Yes, my goodness. And, speaking of John Adams and speaking of politics, you have our current president, Donald Trump, on your website now, who has been identified as Nero. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I started to work with Kevin Ryerson in 2001, and through time, I realized that his spirit guide Atun Ray could make accurate past life matches. And so at that point, I started to ask about all sorts of people.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of Trump, somebody else actually figured out the Nero connection. Actually, it's the person on our website who's identified as the reincarnation of the actor James Dean.
Okay.
He emailed me. Of course, he's now very much into reincarnation. And he emailed me and he said, I'm really sure about this, but I think Trump was Nero. Well, in a session with Kevin, Atun Ray affirmed that. And on the website, you'll see that there's definitely a facial resemblance. And on the website, there is a search bar. So if you want to see the Trump case, you just put in the search bar Donald Trump. Now, recently, people have been wondering what Trump's connection with Vladimir Putin is.
Yes.
Everybody's kind of baffled. Why does he seem to like this guy and not like any of our allies? And so I asked Atun Ray that, did Trump and Putin have a past lifetime together that would explain their affinity? because people do come back in groups.
That's right. I saw
And
that on your site. I'm
yeah,
excited for you to share that.
and Atin said, well, they were both emperors. And I said, what do you mean? And he said that Putin was Julius Caesar. And he said that if you look at the busts or, images of Nero and Putin, you'll see a very exact resemblance. So, of course, I then start to hunt around in the internet to compare images, and I found that somebody already did it. I'm not really sure who they did.
That's
but
interesting.
They did a split screen where they have the face of Putin on one side and the face of one side is the face of Caesar, on the other side, the face of Putin, and I mean it's the same face.
Amazing. Now, what does this mean for us? I know we've been talking about it, but there's always the presidential election was so controversial. I talked to people on both sides who voted for both people. I have a lot of clients in my private practice, and it was so divisive. And, when you think of the bigger picture here, can you talk a little bit about Nero? And there were some misconceptions about him. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how this can help everyone come together, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, right?
Right. Well, first of all, one thing that we observe in reincarnation cases is we're pretty much the same person from lifetime to lifetime.
Okay.
The circumstances change.
Okay.
I mean, hopefully we develop and evolve over time, but in the Nero Trump case, they're very similar. And Nero was considered to be very narcissistic, self-centered, not a very nice person.
Okay.
And it was he's sort of known for being responsible for allowing Rome to burn. And the speculation was that Nero did that so that he could build a huge palatial complex on the site. History books kind of dispute that and say that Nero was actually in a city 30 or 40 miles away when the fire broke out. And they say that when it broke out, he actually came back to Rome to try to help the survivors. So there's some discrepancy there, but
Sure.
In both lifetimes, they were obsessed with building beautiful palaces. And Nero eventually did build this huge palace, which was called the Golden House, because it featured so much gold leaf. And Trump's apartment in Trump Tower is also known to extensively use gold leaf.
Yes.
So,
Incredible.
It's sort of the same type of guy. And in terms of politics, I don't know how much this is going to change things. I mean, I don't know if Trump is open to this or Putin is open to this, but Trump has kind of hit a nerve with people who think like he does, basically, and because he himself is very critical of others and he humiliates others and actually incites conflict. He's drawn people to him who are like that also. And so, I don't know from the past lives if we can really change things, but, he'll be in office for a while, then somebody else will come along and life will go on. And hopefully, when he dies and has his afterlife review, he'll realize how much he hurt people, and hopefully he'll change for the better.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to go back to always that we're just reincarnating over and over again, aren't we? And it's very interesting that looking at everything in this perspective. I mean, you have people on your site, again, like we said, from all different cultures. They reincarnate back and forth. And, you have a lot of interesting people, even like Paul McCartney was Antonio Vivaldi, and people that are doing similar things in each lifetime, like musicians, or politicians and things like that. I love one of the things you say, Walter, reincarnation research is the new technology of spirit. Can you talk a little bit about that quote?
Well, it's, I'd like to point out that, the world's religions rely on information that was produced 2,000 years ago, or
right.
at least 1,000 years ago. Islam was founded in about 800 AD, and Christianity, of course, 2,000 years ago, and Judaism, 6,000 years ago. And I point out that if we were using the same transportation technology from 2,000 years ago, we'd be, riding around on donkeys.
Right.
But now we have planes, trains, and automobiles.
Yeah.
So, spiritual development has to evolve just like anything else. And now with evidence of reincarnation, spirituality is really entering a scientific phase. And that's where the technology of spirit comes from.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. It's important to again look at things from a broader lens. And I also want to talk about your friends with my brother-in-law, Gary Renard, and my sister, Cindy. And I wanted you to talk to the viewers a little bit about split lifetimes, split reincarnations, or parallel lives, which Gary is with another good friend of ours, Michael Tamura.
So split incarnation is when one soul can animate more than one body at a time. And again, on the Reincarnation Research website, on the left side, you'll see a category, split incarnation, and you can see independently researched cases that demonstrate this. And even Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia accepted these cases because he found them also. And he called them cases with anomalous dates because the lifetimes overlap. We have sort of conventionally thought in reincarnation that, you incarnate as like a singular packet, that you have a lifetime, you die, there's an intermission, and then you incarnate again, and it's sequential. But the way the soul is actually multidimensional.
Yes.
And can project itself into more than one body at a time. And I use the analogy that most of us have one head and two arms, but the two arms are controlled by the same mind. You can think of each arm as an incarnation, but the incarnation is part of one mind.
I love that way to look at it. Great way to explain it.
And so, but in the case of Gary Renard and Michael Tamura, I had been going early on when I was still trying to sort out this John Adams thing. Michael was one of the people that I went to, and I asked him, "Am I really the reincarnation of John Adams?" And he said, "I was." But then I started to go to his seminars, and he became a source of emotional support for me. Both he, Michael, and his wife Raphael.
Yes, we love them.
And in going to his seminars, Michael would share that he is the reincarnation of the Apostle Thomas. Well, when he said that, I was kind of skeptical. I thought, I don't know if this is true. And so in a session with Kevin Ryerson, I asked Atun, and Atun confirmed it. And, I was surprised he confirmed it, but he did.
But he did.
So I accepted it, and life went on. And then a few years later, Gary Renard came out with his book, Disappearance of the Universe. And I was reading it, and in that book, he says he's the reincarnation of the Apostle Thomas. And I go, wait a second, Michael says he's the reincarnation.
What's
and
going on? Yeah.
I thought either Gary's wrong or this is a split incarnation situation. Mm-hmm. And so again, in a session with Kevin, I asked Atun, and Atun said, yes, Gary is also an incarnation of the Apostle Thomas, and Michael and Gary are splits. Well, another part of the story is Michael told me that he, in addition to being the Apostle Thomas, remembered being part of the American Revolution also.
Yes.
And, he said, I don't know who I was specifically, but I remember that I was on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Well, there's only 5 people on that committee, and Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and then 2 others. And I noticed that Michael looked like one of the committee members named Roger Sherman.
Roger Sherman, that's right.
Who happened to be a cobbler, but also a representative to the Continental Congress. And he was also, history books say he was one of the most spiritual people of the Congress. And so I asked in a session with Kevin Ryerson, was Michael also Roger Sherman? And Atun said, yes, he was. And I fed this back to Michael. And I said, yeah, you were Roger Sherman. He was on the committee. He happened to be a shoemaker, a cobbler. And then Michael says, well, that's interesting because I've always been fascinated with shoe design. And he even submitted a patent for the design of a sandal. And,
oh my goodness, that I didn't know.
Having a spiritual teacher, clairvoyant, being interested in designing sandals is, kind of a unique trait. Yeah. But right. He had that in 2 lifetimes. And, I matched up the pictures of Roger Sherman and Michael, and they match. But then when I heard about Gary Renard being Thomas, that meant Gary Renard also was an incarnation of Roger Sherman. In other words, the same soul, right. Incarnated as Sherman. And I asked Gary if he had any pictures I could use in the same pose that I had of Sherman. And he sent me one, which is actually absolutely stunning. I mean,
it is.
He looks so much.
Viewers can go to your website.
Yeah, it's uncanny. Yeah. So by correlation, we can say we now know what the Apostle Thomas looked like.
So interesting.
Oh, and then the other fascinating incident was that Michael and Gary were in San Francisco at the same time, and I arranged for all of us to have a dinner. And Michael and Gary were sitting opposite each other, and Raphael, Michael's wife, and I were, we were looking at them, and they looked like 2 identical twins in a mirror. Even though Michael is Japanese and has, Asian features, right. Otherwise it's like the same face. And right. And Michael and Gary became good friends. Yes. And Michael, who's also an ordained minister, even did the marriage ceremony for Gary and his wife, Cindy.
That's right. I was there and loved every minute of that. We're all part of this soul family here. right?
You can be sure Jesus was there in spirit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a conversation, a whole nother episode about that. But yes, and it's wonderful. Speaking of Gary, and which brings up A Course in Miracles, a spiritual teaching, and that has been my chosen path. You have one of the most prolific teachers of A Course in Miracles on your site now, Ken Wapnick.
Right.
And boy, we sure love Ken. And can you talk a little bit about his case?
Yeah, the way that evolved was I met a woman named Susan Trout. So Susan invited me to do a presentation at her organization, which is called the Institute for the Advancement of Service.
Okay.
And when I met her, she shared that she believes she's the reincarnation of Teresa of Avila.
Interesting.
And there's definite parallels because Teresa of Avila was known for serving and reforming the Carmelite order. She served people all her life at the expense of her own personal life. So there's similarities. But again, I asked Atunre in a session with Kevin, and he said that's correct. And Susan has even contributed her own article on the Reincarnation Research website explaining all the parallels and
Wow.
how she came to believe that she's the reincarnation of Teresa of Avila. Well, Susan also told me that she believes that Ken Wapnick was a mentor to her and very, very dear close friend. And she believes that he died. So he was the reincarnation of John of the Cross. And the history is that Teresa of Avila was running a whole series of nunneries or convents, and she needed help. And so she enlisted John of the Cross to be her right-hand man.
Mm-hmm.
And so Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross were as close as any two people could be. And that relationship was replicated between Ken Wapnick and Susan Trout. And so in a session with Kevin, again, I asked, was Ken Wapnick St. John of the Cross? And he affirmed it. And I did meet Ken, and we talked about it, and he accepts that.
Okay.
But during his lifetime, he didn't want it publicized.
Right.
When he passed away, I did an addendum to the Teresa of Avila case, that the narrative that Susan Trout wrote, and posted that he is the reincarnation of John of God, or yes. I'm sorry, John of the Cross.
John of the Cross, yes. And also, it's interesting because Ken talks about in his talks, sometimes it would come up that he was going to go to the monastery, and that was going to be a path of his. Right. And then he found A Course in Miracles and knew that was his path to study that and teach that. So it's an interesting.
Again, it's I said before that we're pretty much the same person from one lifetime to another, and these two cases involving Wapnick and Trout show that in a spectacular way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking to myself, I've had several readings with Kevin where Tunray has come through. And those of you maybe watching the 24th hour for the first time, there are there's an interview with Walter from a few years ago, a couple with Kevin and Michael and Raphael Tamura. So you may want to check those out because they're all really good, packed with information. And what I was going to say is I was just thinking of my own life, and I've been identified as journalists in past life, bringing the good news right. And focusing on spiritual themes or whatever you would call it at the time. I also did channelings, and we're really trying to bring people together and connect them with their different lives, with past loved ones that, that have passed, and counseling in a way, and everything is kind of coming back or has come back in this lifetime. So I believe that to be true, especially in my own experience. Again, sometimes they're called different things, or take on a slightly different role within the same genre. But both, broadcast journalism and psychology have been my focus in these lifetimes, and it's not the first time.
Yep.
So it's just
the way it. I guess I'd like to mention. I have one book called Born Again, which contains what I consider the most important cases that show evidence of reincarnation.
Okay.
But I have another book called Origin of the Soul and the Purpose of Reincarnation, in which consists of my dialogues with the spirit being Atun Ray. After I realized, wow, I'm talking to a real spirit who's extremely intelligent, in addition to utilizing him to make past life matches, I thought, I should ask him the bigger picture questions, like when were souls created? Why do we reincarnate? When does reincarnation end? And so Origin of the Soul and Purpose of Reincarnation consists of my dialogues with Atun Ray.
I love that.
Yeah. And just to kind of give a brief overview, Atun Ray says that all souls were created all at the same time, just a nanosecond after the Big Bang. And at the time that souls are created, they're imbued with what I call an energy spectrum, a certain spectrum or band of abilities or talents. And that stays consistent from lifetime to lifetime. And that's why in the reincarnation cases, artists come back as artists, politicians come back as politicians, in your case, journalists come back as journalists.
Right.
So, God creates us in a certain way. And then what we have to do through reincarnation is, first of all, we have to develop identity. I make the point that think if you had no memories at all, what would your identity be? Well, you wouldn't have an identity because you don't have any experiences. So part of the reason we reincarnate or incarnate and reincarnate is to develop a strong sense of identity, which is based on your memories and experiences. Secondly, you have to develop your God-given gifts. So if you're given abilities as a visual artist, you're going to have a series of lifetimes where you train and develop that talent. And then Atun Ray says, to stop reincarnation, you have to do that. You have to develop your talents. You also have to work off any bad karma that you accumulated by doing bad things in prior lifetimes. You have to atone for that on the earth. And then finally, he said that people have to develop an all-inclusive love for humanity. And after you achieve those things, you don't have to reincarnate anymore. You can just continue your evolution in the spirit realms. So that's all you have to do.
That's it? No, oh my gosh. Well, Walter, this has been fantastic. I am sure we will have you on again. And for those of you that are on my membership platform, Patreon, we're going to have some additional interview with Walter and some additional information. We're going to have a chat behind the scenes. And I want to encourage everyone to go to reincarnationresearch.com. And there's just so much there, and it's so interesting. And I want to thank you, Walter, so much for joining me. And I'm sure we're going to chat again.
And if I could say, we also have a Reincarnation Research Facebook page.
Oh, good.
And if you sign up for that, follow us. I'm constantly putting up new cases, and I notify people of the new cases through our Facebook page.
I love it. I love it. And what's the name? What's it called? Your Facebook page?
It's just at Reincarnation Research. So Reincarnation Research, again, is one word, and you just have the @ symbol before it.
Fantastic. Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much again, Walter.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I am wearing an official Reincarnation Research t-shirt. Let me get people
I love that.
And on the back of it, it says reincarnationresearch.com, a path to peace. And if people contribute $50 through the website, you get a free t-shirt.
I love it. I love that. I want that t-shirt.
Oh, yeah. I'll send you one gratis.
Awesome. But I love that. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to comment on your shirt.
So I'll send you and Mark one. Just let me know, email me your sizes and where I should ship.
All right. And Mark is saying thank you. He's giving me a thumbs up. But we'll definitely talk with you again. And again, Walter, including his donation section there on the site to support this research, I think as we're all moving towards being more peaceful here, all these things are helpful, all this work. And so again, I'll be chatting behind the scenes with Walter for those of you on Patreon. And I just want to thank you again, Walter, for joining me. And I want to thank all of you for joining me on the 24th hour. Walter,
thank you for helping spread the good news.
Oh, you're so welcome. And Dr. Walter Semkiw is wonderful for reminding us that we are all one family. And isn't it helpful to pull back the lens and look at things from a broader perspective? I believe it's a big step in the greater mind awakening when we can recognize our shared interests in wanting peace and wanting to express our talents and gifts in service to the whole while we're on our journey awakening to spirit, our true home, perfect oneness. I'm Jackie Lora Jones. Until next time, be well and blessings, everyone. I'll see you soon.